The sheriff decided to intimidate a black family by turning their picnic into a horrific experience with beatings and arrests. But his actions led to unexpected consequences that turned the tables. Subscribe so you don't miss how justice was served. Where are you watching this video? Write it in the comments. Elijah Grayson sat behind the wheel of his old pickup truck, the tires crunching over gravel as he made his way down the winding road that led to the family farm. It was late afternoon, and the golden light of the setting sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the fields. He could already see the outline of the farmhouse in the distance, a silhouette against the backdrop of sprawling acres of land that had been in his family for generations. A familiar tightness formed in his chest, a mix of nostalgia and anxiety. He had always known he would come back here someday, but he never imagined it would be like this. The family farm had seen better days. The fence posts were weathered and sagging, and the paint on the farmhouse had started to peel, revealing bare wood underneath. It had been several years since anyone had taken care of the land properly, not since his father passed away. Now it was up to Elijah to bring it back to life. He pulled the truck to a stop in front of the house and turned off the engine, taking a deep breath before stepping out. As he walked towards the front door, he could feel the memories flooding back, memories of running through the fields as a boy, of watching his father work the land with hands that seemed as much a part of the earth as the soil itself. Elijah smiled at the thought, but the smile faded as he took in the state of disrepair. The place looked tired, and he knew it would take more than just elbow grease to restore it to what it once was. Still, it was home. It was his. "Daddy, look." Elijah turned to see his 8-year-old daughter, Naomi, bounding out of the truck, her braids bouncing as she ran towards the house. She pointed at a weathered swing hanging from the old oak tree in the front yard. "Can I try it?" Elijah smiled, his heart warming at her enthusiasm. "Go ahead, sweetheart, but be careful. It's been a while since anyone's used that swing." Naomi nodded and raced off, her laughter echoing across the empty yard. Elijah watched her for a moment before turning his attention back to the house. His wife, Sarah, climbed out of the truck more slowly, her eyes scanning the farmhouse and the surrounding fields. She looked worried, and Elijah couldn't blame her. He knew what she was thinking, that this place was more than just a fixer-upper. It was a gamble, a leap of faith. "It's going to be a lot of work," Sarah said, her voice filled with uncertainty. "I know," Elijah replied, stepping closer to her and taking her hand. "But it's worth it. This is our land. It's our legacy." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "I just hope we're doing the right thing, Elijah. I mean, look at this place. It's falling apart. And the people here, they weren't exactly welcoming the last time we visited." Elijah nodded. He remembered all too well the looks they had gotten from the neighbors when they came to the farm for his father's funeral. The cold stares, the whispered comments. He knew that being a black man trying to run a farm in this part of the country was not going to be easy, but he also knew that he couldn't let that stop him. "We'll make it work," he said, his voice firm. "We're not just doing this for us, we're doing it for Naomi, for her future." Sarah sighed, then gave him a small smile. "All right, let's get to work then." Together, they walked towards the house, and Elijah pushed open the creaky front door. The air inside was stale, and dust hung in the beams of sunlight that filtered through the windows. He set his jaw, determination settling in his chest. This was just the beginning. There was a lot to be done, but Elijah was ready for it. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elijah sat on the porch steps, a cup of coffee in his hands. The sky was a deep shade of purple, and the first stars were beginning to appear. He watched as Sarah and Naomi unpacked some of their belongings inside the house, their silhouettes moving behind the windows. He took a sip of his coffee, savoring the warmth, and let his mind wander back to his father. He remembered the long days working side by side, his father teaching him how to till the soil, how to care for the crops, how to respect the land. "The land will take care of you if you take care of it," his father used to say. Elijah had always believed that. It was one of the reasons he decided to come back. This land was a part of him, just as it had been a part of his father and his grandfather before him. But Elijah also knew that times had changed. The world wasn't the same as it was when his father was alive. The neighbors weren't the same either. They had made that abundantly clear the last time he was here. He had heard the whispers, comments about how people like him didn't belong here, about how the land should be sold to real farmers. Elijah clenched his jaw at the memory, but he forced himself to push the anger aside. He wasn't here to prove anything to anyone. He was here for his family, for his daughter. He was here because this land was his, and no one was going to take it from him. The next morning, Elijah woke up early, the first light of dawn just beginning to peek over the horizon. He dressed quietly so as not to wake Sarah and Naomi, then stepped outside into the cool morning air. The fields stretched out before him, bathed in the soft glow of sunrise. For a moment, he just stood there, taking it all in. The sight of the land, the smell of the earth, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. It was peaceful, and it reminded him of why he had decided to come back. Elijah spent the next few hours walking the property, making notes of what needed to be done. The fences needed repairing, the fields needed tilling, and the barn needed a miracle. He could see the work piling up in front of him, but instead of feeling overwhelmed, he felt a sense of purpose. This was his chance to rebuild, to create something lasting for his family. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Elijah heard the sound of a car approaching. He turned to see a dusty pickup truck pulling up to the edge of the property. A man stepped out, tall, with a worn cowboy hat and a stern expression. Elijah recognized him immediately. It was Mr. Brown, one of the neighboring farmers. Elijah had met him briefly at his father's funeral, and the encounter had been far from friendly. "Morning," Elijah called, forcing a smile as he approached the truck. Mr. Brown looked at him for a long moment before nodding. "Morning. Heard you were back. Figured I'd come by and see for myself." Elijah could hear the skepticism in the man's voice, but he kept his own tone polite. "Yeah, we're back. Got a lot of work to do, but we're looking forward to getting the place up and running again." Mr. Brown grunted, his eyes scanning the farmhouse and the fields. "This ain't exactly the kind of place for folks like you," he said, his voice low. Elijah felt a flash of anger, but he kept his expression neutral. "This land has been in my family for 3 generations," he said evenly. "I'm not planning on going anywhere." Mr. Brown stared at him for a moment, then shook his head. "Well, good luck to you then," he said, his tone making it clear that he didn't mean it. He turned and climbed back into his truck, slamming the door before driving off. Elijah watched the truck disappear down the road, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He knew that this was just the beginning, that there would be more challenges, more people like Mr. Brown who thought he didn't belong. But as he turned back to look at the farmhouse, at the fields that stretched out before him, Elijah felt a surge of determination. This was his land, and he was going to fight for it, no matter what. He took a deep breath, letting the cool morning air fill his lungs, and then walked back towards the house. There was a lot of work to be done, and he was ready to get started. The first few days on the farm were a blur of work and exhaustion. Elijah woke up before dawn each day, determined to make a start on the long list of tasks that needed to be tackled. The fences were falling apart, the fields were overgrown with weeds, and the barn roof had a hole the size of a small car. There was no shortage of things to do, and Elijah was prepared for it. What he wasn't prepared for was the resistance he would face from the people around him. On the third morning, Elijah made his way into town to buy some supplies. He parked his truck in front of the hardware store and stepped out, taking a moment to glance around. The town was small, just a few streets lined with old brick buildings and wooden storefronts, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's business. Elijah could feel the eyes on him as he walked towards the store, people glancing his way, some staring openly, others whispering to each other. He kept his head held high, refusing to let their stares bother him. Inside the hardware store, Elijah grabbed a cart and began filling it with the items he needed: nails, tools, lumber. He was halfway through his list when he noticed the store clerk, a middle-aged man with graying hair, watching him from behind the counter. Elijah nodded in his direction, trying to be polite. "Morning," Elijah said. The clerk barely acknowledged him, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What can I help you with?" he asked, his tone clipped. Elijah held up his list. "Just getting some supplies for my farm. Got a lot of repairs to do." The clerk glanced at the list, then back at Elijah. "You're the one who moved into the old Grayson place, aren't you?" Elijah nodded. "That's right. It was my father's. I'm fixing it up." The clerk's lips tightened into a thin line. "I see." He paused for a moment, then added, "You sure you want to be doing that? It's a lot of work, and folks around here, well, they aren't used to seeing people like you trying to run a farm." Elijah felt his chest tighten, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I appreciate your concern," he said, his voice steady, "but this is my family's land, and I'm not going anywhere." The clerk gave a noncommittal grunt and turned away, muttering something under his breath. Elijah clenched his jaw and continued with his shopping, trying to ignore the knot of frustration in his stomach. He knew this wouldn't be easy. He knew that some people would rather see the farm fall into disrepair than see him succeed, but he wasn't going to let them win. After paying for the supplies, Elijah loaded everything into the back of his truck. Just as he was about to get in, he heard someone call his name. He turned to see a man approaching, tall, with a friendly smile and a baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. "Hey, you're Elijah, right? Elijah Grayson?" the man said, extending his hand. Elijah nodded, shaking the man's hand. "That's right. And you are?" "Name's Tom. I own the feed store down the road," the man said. "Heard you were back in town. Figured I'd come by and introduce myself." Elijah smiled, feeling a small sense of relief. "Good to meet you, Tom. I could use a good feed supplier. Got a lot of work ahead of me." Tom nodded. "Yeah, I can imagine. Your dad had quite the place back in the day. It's good to see someone trying to bring it back." He hesitated for a moment, then added, "Listen, if you need anything, just let me know. Not everyone around here is as friendly as they should be, but there are folks who want to see you succeed." Elijah felt a surge of gratitude. "Thanks, Tom. I appreciate that. I'll definitely be stopping by your store soon." Tom gave him a nod and a smile before turning and heading back down the street. Elijah watched him go, feeling a mix of emotions, relief that at least one person was willing to offer help, but also a deep-seated frustration at the attitudes of others. He knew this wasn't going to be an easy road, but he was more determined than ever to make it work. Back at the farm, Elijah spent the afternoon repairing the fence along the edge of the property. The sun was high in the sky, beating down on his back as he worked. He pounded nail after nail into the old wood, his muscles aching from the effort. But the physical labor was a welcome distraction. It gave him something to focus on, something he could control. As he worked, Elijah noticed a figure approaching from the direction of the road. He straightened, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. It was one of his neighbors, a man named Carl, who owned the property next door. Elijah had seen him a few times since moving in, but they hadn't spoken much. Carl stopped a few feet away, his hands shoved into the pockets of his overalls. He looked at the fence, then at Elijah. "You planning on fixing all of this?" he asked, his tone skeptical. Elijah nodded. "That's the plan. Got a lot of work ahead, but I'll get there." Carl grunted, his expression unreadable. "You know, some folks around here don't think you belong," he said, his voice low. "They think you should just sell the place and move on." Elijah felt a flicker of anger, but he kept his voice calm. "This land belonged to my father, and his father before him. I'm not going anywhere." Carl studied him for a long moment, then shrugged. "Well, it's your funeral," he said, turning and walking away without another word. Elijah watched him go, his fists clenching at his sides. He knew that attitudes like Carl's were going to be a problem, but he refused to let them deter him. This was his land, and he was going to fight for it, no matter what anyone said. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Elijah sat on the porch steps, watching Naomi play in the front yard. She was chasing fireflies, her laughter filling the air, and for a moment, Elijah felt a sense of peace. He knew there were challenges ahead, but moments like this made it all worth it. He glanced over at Sarah, who was sitting in a rocking chair, her eyes on Naomi, a small smile playing on her lips. "I talked to one of the neighbors today," Elijah said after a moment. "Carl, he thinks we should sell and leave." Sarah sighed, her smile fading. "And what did you tell him?" Elijah met her gaze, his expression firm. "I told him we're not going anywhere. This is our home and we're going to make it work." Sarah reached over and took his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I know we will. It's hard, Elijah. Harder than I thought it would be." Elijah nodded, his eyes drifting back to Naomi. "I know, but we're stronger than they think. We'll get through this." Sarah smiled, a hint of determination in her eyes. "Yes, we will." As the last light of day faded and the stars began to appear in the sky, Elijah felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead was going to be long and difficult, but he wasn't alone. He had his family, and he had the land that was rightfully his. And no matter what obstacles came his way, he was ready to face them head on. The following weeks brought a relentless string of challenges. Elijah threw himself into the work on the farm, but it seemed like every time he made progress, something or someone tried to set him back. It wasn't just the endless physical labor of repairing fences, fixing machinery, and clearing fields. It was the mounting pressure from the people around him, led by none other than Sheriff Harper. One Tuesday morning, Elijah was working on clearing a particularly overgrown section of the field when he heard the sound of a vehicle approaching. He looked up to see a police cruiser pulling up the driveway. Elijah wiped the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve, his eyes narrowing as the car came to a stop. Sheriff Harper stepped out, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, his expression unreadable. "Mornin', Grayson," Harper called as he walked over, his boots crunching on the gravel. His tone was almost cheerful, but Elijah could hear the edge behind it. "Sheriff," Elijah replied, keeping his voice neutral, "what brings you out here today?" Harper glanced around the property, his lips curling into a half smile. "Just doing my rounds, making sure everything's in order. Heard some complaints from a few of your neighbors. Said you've been making a lot of noise early in the morning. Thought I'd come check it out." Elijah felt a flicker of frustration. He knew the complaints were just an excuse. He had been careful not to disturb anyone, but it was clear that some of his neighbors were determined to make trouble. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his temper in check. "Just doing some work on the farm, Sheriff. Nothing more than what needs to be done." Harper nodded, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Uh-huh. Well, some folks around here are a little particular about how things are done. They like peace and quiet. I'd hate for you to get into any trouble, Grayson." Elijah clenched his jaw, the underlying threat in Harper's words clear. "I'm just trying to take care of my land, Sheriff," he said evenly. "That's all." Harper stared at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Sure thing, Grayson. Just remember, folks around here have a way of dealing with things when they don't like how they're going." He turned and walked back to his cruiser, tipping his hat as he climbed inside. "Have a good day now." Elijah watched as the car drove away, a knot of anger and frustration tightening in his chest. He knew that Harper wasn't going to make this easy. The sheriff had made it clear that he didn't want Elijah here, and he was going to do whatever he could to push him out. That evening, Elijah sat down at the kitchen table, his face etched with exhaustion. Sarah placed a plate of food in front of him, her eyes filled with concern. "Another visit from Sheriff Harper today?" she asked, sitting down across from him. Elijah nodded, running a hand over his face. "Yeah, said there were complaints about the noise. He's just looking for any reason to make trouble." Sarah sighed, her brows knitting together. "I don't understand why they can't just leave us alone. We're not hurting anyone, we're just trying to make a life here." "They don't want us here," Elijah said, his voice low. "They think we don't belong, that this land shouldn't be ours. Harper's going to keep coming back, trying to intimidate us until we give up." Naomi, who had been sitting quietly at the end of the table, looked up, her eyes wide. "Daddy, are we in trouble? Are they going to take our farm away?" Elijah's heart ached at the fear in his daughter's voice. He forced a smile, reaching out to take her hand. "No, sweetheart. No one's going to take our farm. This is our home, and we're not going anywhere. I promise." Naomi nodded, but Elijah could see the worry in her eyes. He wished he could do more to reassure her, but the truth was, he didn't know what was going to happen. He only knew that he wasn't going to back down. This land was his, and he was going to fight for it, for his family, for his daughter. The next morning, Elijah woke to the sound of someone pounding on the front door. He groaned, rubbing his eyes as he climbed out of bed. The sun was barely up, and the sky outside was still tinged with the soft gray of dawn. Sarah stirred beside him, her voice groggy. "Who could that be at this hour?" Elijah shook his head, pulling on his shirt as he made his way to the door. When he opened it, he found Carl, his neighbor, standing on the porch, his face flushed with anger. Behind him, Elijah could see a few other neighbors gathered at the edge of the property, their expressions equally hostile. "What's going on, Carl?" Elijah asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Carl jabbed a finger in Elijah's direction. "Your damn cows got out last night, trampled right through my field, ruined half my crop." Elijah frowned, his stomach sinking. "What? That can't be. I checked the fence yesterday. It was secure." "Well, it ain't secure now," Carl snapped. "And I'm telling you, Grayson, if this happens again, there are going to be consequences. You think you can just come in here and do whatever you want? You don't belong here, and you never will." Elijah took a deep breath, trying to keep his anger in check. "I'll come take a look at the fence. If it's broken, I'll fix it. And I'll pay for any damage." Carl shook his head, his lips curling into a sneer. "Don't bother. We don't need your kind around here, Grayson. You'd be better off just packing up and leaving." Elijah's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I'm not going anywhere, Carl. This is my home, and I'm going to take care of it, whether you like it or not." Carl glared at him for a moment longer before turning and stomping away, the other neighbors following behind him. Elijah watched them go, a sense of helplessness washing over him. He knew that no matter how hard he tried, there were some people who would never accept him. But that didn't mean he was going to give up. Later that day, Elijah walked the perimeter of the property, inspecting the fences. He found the section that had been broken, the wood splintered, the wire pulled away. It didn't look like an accident. Someone had done this on purpose, trying to create trouble. Elijah felt a surge of frustration, but he pushed it aside, focusing on the task at hand. He gathered his tools and began repairing the fence, his hands moving with practiced precision. As he worked, he heard the sound of a car approaching. He looked up to see Tom, the owner of the feed store, pulling up in his truck. Tom climbed out, giving Elijah a nod. "Heard about what happened," he said, walking over. "Figured you could use a hand." Elijah felt a wave of gratitude. "Thanks, Tom. I appreciate it." Tom picked up a hammer and began helping Elijah with the repairs. They worked in silence for a while, the only sounds the clinking of tools and the rustle of the wind through the trees. Finally, Tom spoke, his voice quiet. "You know, not everyone around here is like Carl and Harper. There are folks who want to see you succeed. You just got to hang in there." Elijah nodded, his eyes focused on the fence. "I know. It's hard. They keep trying to push me out." Tom gave him a sympathetic look. "I get it, but you're doing good work here, Elijah, and there are people who see that. Don't let the rest of them get to you." Elijah took a deep breath, feeling a renewed sense of determination. "Thanks, Tom. I won't." They finished the repairs just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. Elijah watched as Tom drove away, then turned back to look at the fields. The challenges were far from over. He knew that. But as he stood there, the cool evening breeze brushing against his skin, Elijah felt a sense of resolve. This was his land, his home, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it from him. He walked back towards the house, the sky above him fading into a deep shade of blue. There was still so much work to be done, but Elijah knew one thing for certain: he wasn't alone. And as long as he had his family and the support of people like Tom, he would keep fighting, no matter what. It had been a long and difficult few weeks, but Elijah and his family had started to settle into something resembling a routine. The work on the farm was exhausting, and the resistance from the neighbors was constant. but Elijah refused to let it break him. He worked from sunup to sundown, repairing fences, tending the fields, and fixing up the house. Sarah did what she could to keep the household running, and Naomi, despite the tension that often filled the air, managed to find moments of joy, exploring the farm and playing outside. One weekend, Sarah suggested that they take a break, even if just for a few hours. "Let's have a picnic," she said one morning as they sat around the kitchen table. "We need to take a little time to breathe, Elijah, just for today." Elijah looked at her, the weariness evident in his eyes, but he nodded. He knew she was right. They had been working non-stop, and they needed a moment to recharge, to remind themselves of why they were doing all of this. "All right," he said with a small smile. "A picnic sounds good." Sarah smiled back, her eyes lighting up. "I'll pack up some food, and we can set up under the old oak tree. It'll be nice." Naomi's eyes lit up with excitement. "Can I help, Mama? I can make sandwiches." Sarah laughed, nodding. "Of course, you can help, sweetheart." A few hours later, they were sitting under the shade of the large oak tree in the front yard, a blanket spread out on the grass and a picnic basket filled with food. The sun was shining, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Elijah felt a sense of peace. He watched as Naomi chased after a butterfly, her laughter ringing out across the yard. Sarah sat beside him, her hand resting on his, and for a moment it felt like everything might be okay. They were in the middle of eating when Elijah noticed a vehicle coming down the driveway. He squinted against the sun, his expression tensing as he recognized the police cruiser. Sheriff Harper. Elijah's heart sank, and he felt Sarah's hand tighten around his. "What does he want now?" Sarah whispered, her voice filled with worry. Elijah shook his head, his jaw clenching. "I don't know. Just stay calm." The cruiser came to a stop, and Sheriff Harper stepped out, his usual smug expression plastered across his face. He walked over to the family, his eyes scanning the picnic setup. Well, what do we have here? A little family gathering?" Elijah stood, his body tense. "What do you want, Sheriff?" Harper shrugged, a mocking smile playing on his lips. "Got a call from one of your neighbors. Said there was a disturbance. Thought I'd come check it out." Elijah felt his temper flare, but he forced himself to stay calm. "We're just having a picnic, Sheriff. There's no disturbance here." Harper's eyes flicked to Sarah and Naomi, then back to Elijah. "You know, Grayson, folks around here like things a certain way. They don't appreciate people coming in and making a mess of things." Elijah took a step forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "We're not making a mess of anything. We're just trying to live our lives, same as anyone else." Harper's smile faded, and his expression hardened. "Watch your tone, Grayson. I'm just doing my job." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a cold whisper. "And my job is to make sure folks like you know their place." Before Elijah could respond, Harper turned his attention to Naomi, who had stopped playing and was now standing by her mother, her eyes wide with fear. "Daddy?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Elijah felt a surge of protectiveness, his anger boiling over. "You need to leave, Sheriff. Now." Harper smirked, but there was a dangerous glint in his eyes. "Or what? You gonna make me?" The tension hung heavy in the air, and for a moment it seemed like the situation might escalate further. But then Sarah stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Please, Sheriff, we're not doing anything wrong. Just let us be." Harper looked at her, then back at Elijah. He seemed to consider her words for a moment before finally stepping back. "All right, Mrs. Grayson, I'll go, but remember, I'm watching you." He turned and walked back to his cruiser, taking his time as he climbed inside. He gave one last look at Elijah before driving away, the tires kicking up dust as he went. Elijah stood there, his heart pounding in his chest, his hands still clenched into fists. He watched until the cruiser disappeared down the road, then turned back to his family. Sarah was holding Naomi, who had tears streaming down her face. "Daddy, are we in trouble?" Naomi asked, her voice barely a whisper. Elijah knelt down in front of her, his heart breaking at the fear in her eyes. He pulled her into a hug, his voice gentle. "No, sweetheart, we're not in trouble. That man, he's just trying to scare us, but we're not going anywhere. This is our home." Naomi clung to him, her small body shaken with sobs. Elijah closed his eyes, holding her tight, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on him. He had known it would be hard, but seeing the fear in his daughter's eyes made him realize just how much they were up against. The rest of the day passed in a haze. The picnic was forgotten, the food left untouched on the blanket. Elijah spent the afternoon repairing the fence along the back of the property, his hands moving with a kind of mechanical precision as he tried to work off the anger that still simmered inside him. He could feel the weight of Harper's words, the threat that lingered behind them. It was clear that the sheriff wasn't going to stop until Elijah and his family were gone. Later that evening, Elijah sat on the porch steps, staring out at the fields as the sun dipped below the horizon. Sarah came out and sat beside him, her presence a comforting weight against his side. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft. Elijah shook his head, his eyes fixed on the fading light. "No, I'm not. I hate that man. I hate what he's doing to us." Sarah reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "I know, but we can't let him win. We can't let him scare us away." Elijah looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and determination. "I'm not going anywhere, but I won't let him do this to us again. Next time I won't back down." Sarah nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We'll get through this, Elijah. Together." Elijah took a deep breath, letting her words sink in. He turned his gaze back to the fields, the darkness slowly enveloping the land. He knew that the road ahead was only going to get harder, but he also knew that he couldn't give up. Not now. Not ever. He had come back to this land to build a future for his family, and he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. No matter what it took, he was going to fight for what was his. The morning after the incident at the picnic, Elijah woke up early, feeling the weight of the previous day still pressing heavily on his shoulders. He had promised his family that he wouldn't let Sheriff Harper intimidate them, but deep down, he knew that Harper was just getting started. Elijah got dressed quietly, careful not to wake Sarah and Naomi, and stepped outside. The early morning air was cool and still, and for a moment, Elijah allowed himself to take in the peacefulness of the farm. He knew he needed to hold on to these small moments of peace, no matter how fleeting. It wasn't long before the day's challenges began. Elijah was walking the perimeter of the property, checking the fences, when he heard the unmistakable sound of a vehicle approaching. He turned to see another police cruiser pulling up, his heart sinking as he recognized the figure stepping out of the car. It wasn't Sheriff Harper this time, but one of his deputies, a younger officer with a stern expression. "Mr. Grayson," the deputy called out, his tone official, "we need you to come with us." Elijah frowned, his stomach tightening. "What's this about?" The deputy stepped closer, a pair of handcuffs dangling from his belt. "We have a warrant for your arrest. Trespassing, destruction of property. You need to come with us, sir." Elijah felt a surge of disbelief. Trespassing. Destruction of property? That's ridiculous. I've done nothing wrong. This is my land. The deputy's face remained expressionless. "I'm just doing my job, sir. Please turn around and place your hands behind your back." Elijah looked around, his eyes scanning the fields, the barn, the house where his family still slept. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, anger and fear churning inside him, but he knew that resisting would only make things worse. Slowly, he turned around, his hands trembling as he placed them behind his back. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into his wrists, and Elijah clenched his jaw, his mind racing. He could only imagine what this was doing to Sarah and Naomi. He just hoped they wouldn't wake up in time to see this. The deputy led him to the cruiser, and Elijah glanced back at the house one last time before being pushed into the back seat. The holding cell was small and dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of sweat and old concrete. Elijah sat on the narrow bench, his head resting in his hands. The hours passed slowly, each minute stretching into what felt like an eternity. He had been denied the chance to make a phone call, and all he could think about was Sarah and Naomi. How long would it be before they knew where he was? What were they thinking right now? Were they afraid? He had promised them he would protect them, and now here he was, locked away while Harper and his men continued their campaign to drive them out. Elijah's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. He looked up to see the cell door opening, and in walked a man he recognized, an attorney from the city named Charles Bailey. Charles had a reputation for taking on tough cases, especially those involving racial discrimination and police misconduct. Elijah had never met him in person, but he knew of his work. "Mr. Grayson," Charles said, his tone professional but warm, "my name is Charles Bailey. Your wife Sarah contacted me. She's very worried about you." Elijah stood, relief washing over him. "Thank you for coming. I didn't think anyone would be able to find me. They wouldn't even let me make a phone call." Charles nodded, his expression grim. "That's not surprising. From what I've heard, Sheriff Harper has been giving you a hard time. It's time we put a stop to that." He paused, looking Elijah in the eye. "I'm going to do everything I can to get you out of here and make sure they can't do this to you again. But you need to be ready. This fight isn't going to be easy." Elijah met Charles's gaze, a sense of determination settling in his chest. "I'm ready. I won't let them push us out." Charles smiled, a glint of admiration in his eyes. "That's what I wanted to hear. Now, let's get you out of here." Later that day, Elijah walked out of the county jail, the afternoon sun blinding after the dim confines of the holding cell. Sarah was waiting for him, her face pale with worry. As soon as she saw him, she rushed forward, wrapping her arms around him, holding him tight. Elijah closed his eyes, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "I was so scared, Elijah," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought they were going to keep you there." Elijah held her close, his heart aching. "I'm okay now. We're going to be okay. Charles is going to help us. We're not alone in this." Sarah pulled back, her eyes searching his face. "But what about Harper? What if he tries this again? I don't want Naomi to see her father taken away like that." Elijah nodded, his jaw tightening. "I know, but we're not backing down. Harper wants us to leave, but we're not going anywhere. Charles said he can help us fight this, and I believe him." He looked over at Naomi, who was sitting in the car, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. Elijah's heart ached at the sight of her, and he knew he needed to be strong. for her, for Sarah, for all of them. That night, back at the farm, Elijah sat at the kitchen table with Charles, going over the details of the case. Charles explained the charges: trespassing, destruction of property, and how they were completely unfounded. "This is a classic case of harassment," Charles said, his voice steady. "Harper is trying to use the law to intimidate you, to make you give up. But we have the evidence on our side. We have witnesses, and we have your story." Elijah listened, his eyes fixed on Charles. "What do we do next?" he asked, his voice filled with determination. Charles leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "First, we need to gather more evidence. We need to document everything, every interaction with Harper, every threat, every instance of harassment. We need to build a case that shows a pattern of behavior, and we need to get the community involved. The more people we have supporting you, the harder it will be for Harper to keep this up." Elijah nodded, a sense of purpose settling in his chest. "I'll do whatever it takes. I'm not going to let him drive us out." Charles smiled. "Good, because this isn't just about you, Elijah. This is about standing up to people like Harper, about showing them that they can't get away with this. And I think you're just the man to do it." Elijah felt a surge of determination. He looked over at Sarah, who was standing in the doorway, listening. She gave him a small, encouraging smile, and Elijah knew that no matter what happened, he wasn't alone. They were in this together, and they were going to fight, not just for their farm, but for their future. The next day, Elijah stood in front of the farmhouse, watching as the sun rose over the fields. The sky was painted in shades of pink and gold, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, Elijah felt a sense of hope. He knew that the road ahead was going to be difficult, that Harper wasn't going to back down without a fight. But he also knew that he wasn't alone. He had his family, he had Charles, and he had the support of people who believed in him. As the first rays of sunlight touched the fields, Elijah took a deep breath, feeling the cool morning air fill his lungs. This was his land, his home, and he was going to fight for it with everything he had. No matter what Harper threw at him, no matter how many times he tried to push them out, Elijah was ready to stand his ground. He turned back towards the house, a sense of resolve settling in his chest. There was work to be done, and he was ready to face whatever came next. This was just the beginning, but Elijah knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going anywhere. Not now, not ever. The days that followed Elijah's release from jail were filled with a mix of tension and determination. He could feel the eyes of his neighbors on him as he worked the land, their disapproving gazes a constant reminder of the battle he was fighting. But for every person who glared at him from a distance, there were others who showed their support, and slowly Elijah began to see the signs of change in the community around him. Word of Elijah's arrest had spread quickly through the small town, and the footage that had surfaced from the picnic incident, captured by a young teenager with a phone, had made its rounds on social media. People who had once been indifferent to Elijah's struggle now saw what he and his family were going through, and they began to speak up. It started with a few people, folks who stopped by the farm to offer their help, dropping off supplies or lending a hand with the repairs. And then it grew. One afternoon, as Elijah was working on repairing a section of the barn roof, he heard the sound of cars pulling up the driveway. He looked up, squinting against the bright sun, and was surprised to see several vehicles parked near the farmhouse. A group of people climbed out, Some of them familiar faces from town, others strangers. They carried tools, food, and supplies, and as they approached, Elijah felt a lump form in his throat. "Hey, Elijah," called Tom, the owner of the feed store. He walked up with a friendly smile, a toolbox in his hand. "Heard you could use a little help. We figured it was time we all pitched in." Elijah climbed down from the ladder, his heart swelling with emotion. He looked at the group of people gathered around, their faces filled with determination and support. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick. "Thank you all so much. I can't tell you what this means to me." A woman stepped forward, her face kind. "We saw what happened," she said. "No one should have to go through that. We're here to help, Elijah. We want you to know that not everyone in this town is like Harper. There are good people here, and we stand with you." Elijah nodded, his eyes glistening. He took a deep breath, feeling a renewed sense of hope. "All right then," he said, his voice steadying. "Let's get to work." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. The community came together, working side by side to repair the damage that had been done. They fixed the barn roof, reinforced the fences, and cleared the fields. Sarah and Naomi helped as well, handing out cold drinks and snacks, their smiles growing brighter with each passing day. Elijah couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude, not just for the help, but for the feeling that maybe, just maybe, they weren't as alone as they had thought. But, despite the progress they were making, Elijah knew that the threat from Sheriff Harper hadn't gone away. He could still feel the tension in the air, the sense that Harper was waiting for his next opportunity to strike. And Elijah knew that it was only a matter of time before that confrontation came. One evening, after a long day of work, Elijah was sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over the fields. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful. Sarah sat beside him, her hand resting on his, and Naomi was playing in the yard, her laughter filling the air. Suddenly, the sound of a car approaching broke the calm. Elijah looked up, his body tensing as he saw a police cruiser pulling up the driveway. His heart sank as he recognized Sheriff Harper behind the wheel. Harper parked the car and climbed out, his expression hard and unreadable. "Evening, Grayson," Harper called, his tone cold. He walked towards the porch, his eyes flicking to Sarah and Naomi before settling on Elijah. "Looks like you've been busy." Elijah stood, his jaw clenched. "What do you want, Harper?" Harper smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Just thought I'd come by and see how things were going. Seems like you've got quite the crowd here lately." Elijah could feel the anger simmering beneath the surface, but he forced himself to stay calm. People are just helping out. It's what a community does. Harper's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer. "You think you can just come in here, stir up trouble, and get everyone on your side? You think that changes anything, Grayson?" Elijah met Harper's gaze, his voice steady. "I'm not trying to stir up trouble. I'm just trying to live my life, take care of my family, and work the land that belongs to me. That's all." Harper's expression darkened, and he stepped even closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You don't belong here, Grayson. You and your family, you're nothing but trouble. And mark my words, I'll be watching. I'll be waiting for the moment you slip up. And when you do, I'll be there to make sure you regret ever coming back." Elijah's fists clenched at his sides, the words hanging heavy in the air. He could feel the rage boiling inside him, the urge to lash out, to fight back. But then he felt Sarah's hand on his arm, her touch grounding him, reminding him of what was truly important. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "We're not going anywhere, Harper," Elijah said, his voice steady. "This is our home, and no matter what you do, we're not leaving." Harper stared at him for a long moment, his eyes filled with disdain. Finally, he took a step back, a cold smile playing on his lips. "We'll see about that," he said, turning and walking back to his cruiser. He gave one last look at Elijah before getting in the car and driving away, the sound of the engine fading into the distance. Elijah stood there, his body still tense, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt Sarah step closer, her arms wrapping around him, and he closed his eyes, letting out a long breath. "You did good," Sarah whispered. "You didn't let him get to you." Elijah nodded, his eyes still fixed on the road where Harper had disappeared. "I just hope it's enough," he said quietly. "I don't know how much longer we can keep this up." Sarah squeezed his arm, her voice filled with determination. "We can. We're stronger than he thinks. And we're not alone anymore. We'll get through this, Elijah. Together." Elijah looked down at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. He nodded, feeling a sense of resolve settle in his chest. "You're right. We'll get through this." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the fields in shadow, Elijah felt a renewed sense of purpose. Harper might have been determined to drive them out, but Elijah knew that he wasn't fighting this battle alone. He had his family, and he had the support of the community. And no matter what Harper tried next, Elijah was ready to stand his ground. This was his land, his home, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it away from him. The morning dawned clear and bright, the sky painted in hues of gold and blue as the first rays of sunlight spread across the fields. Elijah stood on the porch of the farmhouse, his gaze sweeping over the land that stretched out before him. The fields, once overgrown and neglected, were beginning to show signs of life again. Rows of crops sprouted in neat lines, the fences stood strong and repaired, and the barn, once a symbol of decay, had a new roof and freshly painted walls. The farm was coming back to life, and Elijah felt a sense of pride swell within him. It hadn't been easy. Every day had been a struggle, a fight against the land, against the doubts of those around him, and against the relentless pressure from Sheriff Harper. But despite everything, Elijah had stood his ground. And now, as he looked out at the farm, he knew that all the sweat and tears had been worth it. This was his family's land, and they were finally seeing the fruits of their labor. Elijah turned as he heard footsteps behind him. Sarah stepped out onto the porch, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "It's looking good, Elijah," she said softly, her voice filled with warmth. He nodded, a smile playing on his lips. "It is, isn't it? We still have a long way to go, but we're getting there." Sarah leaned into him, her eyes following his gaze out across the fields. "I'm so proud of you, of everything you've done. I know it hasn't been easy, but you never gave up." Elijah wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "I couldn't have done it without you, or without the people who've helped us. We've had so much support. I never thought people would come together like they have." Sarah smiled, nodding. "It's amazing what people can do when they decide to stand together." Later that day, the farm was alive with activity. Word had spread about the progress Elijah and his family were making, and more people from the community had started to come by to lend a hand. Tom was there, helping Elijah with the irrigation system, while a few others worked on building new chicken coops near the barn. The sound of laughter and chatter filled the air, and Elijah felt a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. As he worked, Elijah caught sight of a familiar figure standing at the edge of the field. It was Charles Bailey, the attorney who had come to his aid when things had looked their bleakest. Elijah wiped his hands on a rag and made his way over, a smile spreading across his face. "Charles," Elijah called out, extending his hand. "Good to see you. What brings you out here?" Charles shook Elijah's hand, his eyes scanning the bustling farm. "Just thought I'd come by and see how you're doing. Looks like you've got quite the operation going here." Elijah nodded, pride evident in his eyes. "It's coming along. We've still got a lot of work to do, but it's starting to feel like home again." Charles smiled, nodding. "I'm glad to hear that. You've done an incredible job, Elijah, and you've got a lot of people behind you now. It's not just about the farm anymore. It's about the community. You've inspired people." Elijah felt his throat tighten, emotion welling up inside him. He looked out at the people working on his land, their laughter and camaraderie filling the air. "I just wanted to take care of my family," he said, his voice thick. "I never set out to do anything more than that. But now it feels like we're part of something bigger." Charles clapped him on the shoulder, his smile widening. "You are, Elijah, and don't you forget it. This community needs people like you, people who are willing to stand up for what's right, no matter how hard it gets." Elijah nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Charles, for everything. We couldn't have done this without you." Charles waved a hand dismissively. "You did the hard part, Elijah. I just helped a little along the way. Now, let's get back to work, shall we?" The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. By the time the sun began to set, the farm was transformed. The new chicken coops were finished, the irrigation system was up and running, and the fields had been weeded and cleared. Elijah stood back, taking it all in, a deep sense of satisfaction settling in his chest. They were making progress, real progress, and it felt like a new beginning. That evening, the community gathered around a large bonfire near the barn. The sky was dark, and the stars twinkled above them as they shared food, stories, and laughter. Naomi sat on Elijah's lap, her eyes wide with wonder as she watched the flames dance in the night air. Sarah sat beside them, her head resting on Elijah's shoulder, a contented smile on her lips. Tom raised a glass, his voice carrying over the crackling of the fire. "To Elijah and his family, for their courage, for their determination, and for reminding us all what it means to stand together." The crowd cheered, their glasses raised high, and Elijah felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. He looked at Sarah, then down at Naomi, and his heart swelled with love and pride. This was what they had fought for. This was what they had worked so hard to build. A place where they could belong, where they could be part of something greater than themselves. As the night wore on, Elijah found himself standing at the edge of the firelight, looking out at the fields that stretched into the darkness. He felt a presence beside him and turned to see Charles standing there, his gaze also fixed on the horizon. "You did it, Elijah," Charles said quietly. "You stood your ground, and you won. Harper's not going to be able to touch you now. The whole community is behind you." Elijah nodded, his eyes glistening. "I couldn't have done it alone. I'm grateful for you, for everyone who stood by us." He paused, his gaze drifting back to the fields. "This land, it's always been a part of me, and now it's a part of all of us." Charles smiled, nodding in agreement. "You're right, and that's how it should be." They stood in silence for a moment, the crackling of the fire and the soft murmur of the crowd behind them. Elijah took a deep breath, feeling the cool night air fill his lungs. This was the future he had dreamed of, a future where his family could thrive, where they could be a part of something lasting and meaningful. He turned back towards the fire, towards his family and the community that had come together to support them. As he walked back to join them, Elijah knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. There was still so much work to be done, still so much to build, but for the first time he felt truly at peace. This was his land, his home, and no one was ever going to take it from him. Together they would face whatever came next, and together they would continue to build a future worth fighting for. Thank you for watching to the end. If you liked it, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories. Go to the next video or check out our playlist. There's a lot more to see. Where are you watching this video? Write in the comments. We're very interested.